Hi, this is John Rowell for the Rowell Report. Today is Tuesday, November 18th, 2025, and I thought I would drill down a little bit into the topic of the corruption in Ukraine. Where does it come from? Who's responsible? And you may have seen video reports from France 24 or the BBC or some other Western news media in which all the blame is squarely placed on Russia. So they said, why is Russia responsible for the corruption in Ukraine? Of course, because of the Soviet Union, which is really the same as Russia, so it's just the same. So we're just going to put the blame squarely on Russia. And so I'm going to paint a different story, just doing a little bit of investigation, and hopefully you have the patience to see this through. Anyway, if you're joining me now, please hit the like button to support this channel so I can continue to make more videos, and subscribe. Thank you. So getting back to the topic, what is the whole problem with the corruption in Ukraine? So first and foremost, they're going to blame the Soviet Union or the Soviet system. So historical legacy from the Soviet system. So if this Soviet system was so bad and the legacy is so strong, then it should be the same in all the ex-Soviet republics. So let's go to Czechia, let's go to Slovakia, let's go to Hungary, we even go to Germany, we can go to Poland, we can go to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, we can go to a lot of places. So the problem, if it was so bad and so strong, it should all be the same in all these different countries. And I can tell you that I lived a year in Poland, and I was aware of the legacy of the Soviet Union, how they did business. I think here they mentioned the point of, this is ChatGPT, and so it says, a state-run economy where personal connections mattered more than the rule of law. Well, it's not quite exactly like that. I would say that the Soviet system was full of bureaucracy, so to get things done you had to know people, but it didn't mean that you were skirting the rule of law or that people were intending on carrying out illegal acts because they skirted this big bureaucratic system that was full of paperwork and going to all these different government offices and all the delays and I guess the lack of transparency. So I'm aware of the Soviet system, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people are interested in illegality. It just means that people were looking to try to get things done. In fact, when the Soviet Union fell, a lot of people were... I was there in the middle 90s. So anyway, the point is that you knew how to get things done. And, if you needed a permission to build a home, or you needed some permission from the government, or you needed to get the paperwork processed, there was a way of doing things because you knew someone, you could do things faster. But I think the first point from ChatGPT, historical legacy from Soviet system, means that the Soviet system forced people into illegality, and I don't think that is correct. I think that the people just wanted to get things done within a reasonable amount of time with the least amount of bureaucracy. I think everyone tries to do things that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are trying to do things that are wrong or illegal. It just means that, that people have a certain limit of patience and the Soviet system tested people's patience. So that's the first point there. And then the oligarchs and post-Soviet privatization. Okay, so we see here is the appearance of the oligarchs. So you say, what are the oligarchs? The oligarchs are the individuals who at some point began to accumulate a lot of wealth and began to control certain areas or certain industries or certain countries, like fiefdoms, like feudal lords. So this is important to mention about the oligarchs and the what they call the post-Soviet privatization. So at the end of the Soviet Union, the industries that they had in these countries were to put products on the shelf and to give people jobs. If you went to Romania during the time of the Soviet Union, there was literally 0% unemployment. Why? Because they would get you a job. The work was your right. But it didn't always come with the conditions that a lot of people liked. So I met a refugee who talked about working at a pig processing plant, and they were given quotas. So they had to complete the quotas by the end of the day, and it was very hard, grueling work, and a lot of people would call in sick, and even if they didn't have the full number of employees that were needed to get to that quota, they still had to get to that quota. So they could be working till 7 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m. until they reached that quota. So the work days were very long, and there was very low motivation among the workers to improve this system. It was, very much a top-down. The goals for the different industries was assigned by the top, and then it was filtered down to all these different industries. So they weren't really being run like real businesses. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, they were not capitalized. They were not set up properly. They had too many people as employees, so the costs were too high. So a lot of these companies ran into financial trouble. And so here comes the oligarchs riding to the rescue. So they start scooping up all these really large companies that had all the modern processing equipment, or, if they were making aspirin and vitamins, they had, everything was top notch. It was just very poorly run, in the way it was run, because it was run basically by the state with goals set by the state. So these companies were basically gold mines for these oligarchs. They scooped them up, they added them to their shelf, and then they began to accumulate more money, more power. Then they began to control the government offices. Okay, so the corruption in Ukraine has been squarely pointed towards the oligarchs. And you say, well, it's a post-Soviet privatization. The problem came once the Soviet Union fell. So we start to get into this confusing narrative. Was it the fault of the Soviet Union, or was it the fault of the people living in those countries once the Soviet Union fell? So I can understand the ideology of the West won, we're, superior to the Soviet Union, and, communism doesn't work. The Western style of doing business works, so we showed we were superior to them. And so anyway, this is the important narrative that that you'll get in any school in the Western countries. And so the ideology, it's more important for the ideology to win out than actual facts or the real reasons why things happened in those countries during the end of the Soviet Union when it collapsed. So then they talk about weak institutions and fragmented rule of law. Okay, so this that comes to this, it presents this information and then comes to a conclusion. This allowed corruption to flourish and made accountability rare. Okay, well, and then we have to figure out the cart and the horse. Okay, what is leading the corruption? Is it the corrupt laws and the lack of accountability, or is what is the oligarchic structure, the one that is leading Ukraine towards deeper and deeper corruption? And so anyway, here it doesn't give a specific causality, who's to blame, but in any case, weak institutions, possibly the oligarchs wanted the institutions to stay weak and not to have laws which control the corruption. So anyway, that point is valid, but I mean, the point is, who's really leading the whole corruption issue problem? Who's to blame? Who's maintaining Ukraine as one of the most or the most corrupt country in the world? So then we get down to political compromise and patronage networks. Okay. Then we get here to point 4. I don't know. It's just like a filler point. Possibly. We get to point 5, Russian influence. So here we go. Here we go back with the Western narratives. It's the Russian influence. The Russians are to blame. So basically, if you're an oligarch in Ukraine and you're, manipulating the laws and controlling the politicians who's elected, only your buddies on your list can be elected, and if someone else is elected, they get removed somehow, and you bring in your own friend, and they maintain things for you. Then all you have to do, if they say, hey, we're the anti-corruption organization, we're here to arrest you, you can say, I'm not to blame, it's the Russians. Okay, so this again, the ChatGPT is full of Western narratives, and this is probably something that most people need to be aware of, because whenever they do a search, ChatGPT isn't going to be going at these topics from an objective point of view. It's going to be pulling out the Western narrative, making sure that whatever, fact-checking itself, making sure that all these narratives are in line. So Russian influence. So are we talking about Ukrainian oligarchs and Ukrainian laws and Ukrainian corruption within the government? Or are we talking about Russia being like a controlling everyone like puppets on a string? So again, the fall of the Soviet Union, so we're going to blame the Soviet Union. The Russian influence. So anyway, how long has it been since the Soviet Union fell? Since the early 90s? So we're talking about 30 years, and they're blaming the Soviet Union, and then they're blaming the country that is next door. And then it mentions here about Russian aggression since 2014. Well, what does that have to do with corruption? Oh, and it says the country goes into survival mode. Long-term institutional reforms harder. So the people in Kiev, I guess, are living in the subways, in bunkers. which is not true. If you go to any video from Kiev, you see them bustling about and, cars parked everywhere and government offices full. Russia if Russia has attacked anywhere in Kiev, it's the military-industrial complex factories. We're talking about the electrical stations, substations connected to the military-industrial complex. We're talking about warehouses for military equipment. Russia is not sending missiles to the anti-corruption office, and so they say Ukraine went into survival mode. So they say, okay, we're going to put corruption on the back burner, which is totally false, because if you know from these exemption cards, these white cards, where Ukrainian individuals they got an exemption from being mobilized, and they paid some military recruiter or military official, $5,000 or $8,000 to get this exemption, and also they could pay to get out of the country, so they have to pay someone else that would so that they could get out of the country. This is not managed by Russia. This is all Ukrainian corruption. And you think of all the corruption scandals in Ukraine. These weren't run by Russians. But again, the Western narrative has to come in and dictate the reasoning, the causality. It's the Soviet Union and it's the Russians to blame, and these poor Ukrainians who grew up in the Soviet system, they're incapable of becoming, doing things outside of a corrupt and corrupt manner without kickbacks and all that. So all that is false. If you know anything about corrupt countries, whenever corruption gets into the bones, so to speak, of the society, then it becomes the modus operandi, and you can't just blame it. Like corruption in Mexico, many point back to the colonial period when Spain was there with the viceroy, and all the corruption that happened in Mexico. So they say, well, we're going to blame the corruption on the viceroy and on the King of Spain. You know how much sense that makes? It really makes no sense. When corruption gets into the bones, into the bloodstream, into the the muscles of the society, it's there because the people permit it and use it because it's just the way things are done. So you can't just say that it's some Russian sitting in Moscow who's controlling the corruption in Ukraine, which is a totally ridiculous statement. Then we get here more reasoning behind that. Citizens' lack of trust and past acceptance of small corruption. Again, the Soviet legacy. Okay, let's go back 30 years. International pressure and Western compromise. Before 2014, some Western actors tolerated oligarchic structures for geopolitical stability, made deals with corrupt elites, did not enforce transparency in aid programs. The aid programs, where did they come from? USAID, NED, all these Soros foundations, all the money was coming in there, and why did they foster corruption? Because they wanted to set up their own network, their own system. They wanted to know who was safe, who was trustworthy. So made deals with corrupt elites. So who made deals with corrupt elites? The U.S. State Department made deals with corrupt elites. Do you remember the Hunter Biden scandal about, working for a Ukrainian power company. This is just, it's, and then they go back to point out Russian influence. How about the U.S. influence? Why is it not mentioned here? So, individual leaders bear responsibility too. Oh, they finally get down to the point of individual leaders, the people who are there on site, who live there, and who are not only live within this corrupt system, but foster it and make sure that they take advantage of it for their own benefit. So we get into this confusing narrative: the Soviet Union, the Russians, the Soviet Union, the Russians. Oh, by the way, and maybe some oligarchs and maybe some individual leaders. This is more Western narrative. So anyway, I wanted to drill down a little bit into the point of the oligarchs because, the oligarchs suddenly appeared like mushrooms, after the Soviet Union fell. But no, if you drill down into this, whole topic, you'll see that the oligarchs had started to appear in the 70s, what they call the shadow economies, basically the black market, and so party connected elites. So these are all corrupt Ukrainians who were, still working within the Soviet Union, and were taking advantage of this to, become rich and develop a power structure. So these were setting up kind of the seeds of the post-Soviet Union collapse, corrupt system in Ukraine. And again, I go back to this whole question: if the Soviet Union presence in Ukraine was such a determining factor for corruption, why isn't it a determining factor in Poland, in Germany? East Germany was part of the Soviet Union. Why not in Czechia, in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Romania, in Estonia, in Latvia, in Lithuania? So anyway, we have all these narratives, and it's so important. If anyone is watching these Western media outlets, BBC, CNN, New York Times, France 24, Sky News, all these, what they have to do is, no matter what happens and why, the fault is always Russia. And then they'll say it was the Soviet Union, that is Russia. No, the Soviet Union is not Russia. Soviet Union was a union of Soviet socialist republics. So each republic existed within a larger union, which was managed out of Moscow, but also had, their managed from the different countries. So, the equivalence between Russia and the Soviet Union is a fable. So, but anyway, we get in here and we see about these shadowy businessmen who are running the black markets. And so when we start to see how all of these so-called oligarchs or power structures, influence structures started to show, it is not the legacy of the fall of the Soviet Union. It was corruption within an individual Soviet republic. So basically, the country, each country within the Soviet Union developed either strong measures against corruption or developed corruption depending on the people in that country. So we have, all these different structures that begin to appear. Basically, when the Soviet Union was starting to run out of gas, their system was no longer financially feasible. It began to run low on finances, and they began to be threadbare in their in maintaining the rules and standards. Then all of this corruption began to appear, and it appears in different countries in different measures. So, like I say, if the fault of the corruption in Ukraine was the fault of the Soviet Union, then why isn't this the same in every single Soviet Union republic after the collapse of the Soviet Union? So, anyway, so we get into this whole thing about the development of the oligarchs. We start to get, influence structures, party structures, business structures that, that were getting products to the people, and but doing so, through the black market and through different means. And so all of this kind of developed at the same time in Ukraine. And finally, we come to one particular oligarch that I want to focus on. We have Petro Poroshenko, who is one of the presidents of Ukraine. You may have heard of him. I believe he's under house arrest right now by Zelensky. So he was trying to get back into politics, and so Zelensky put him on house arrest. Basically, Zelensky is kind of a puppet of foreign governments. He was an actor. That's what he knows. How to carry things out as an actor. So he's basically a PR person for this proxy government, which is basically run from Washington. And they didn't want Petro Poroshenko to come back into politics, so they put him under house arrest. Basically, put him in timeout. So, but we can focus a little bit about him. So they said he's not wealthy during. This is the ChatGPT again. He was not wealthy during the Soviet era. He began to. He was good in business, and he started in commodities like cocoa beans and other commodities, and he began to get together capital. And as the Soviet Union collapsed and the various state-run corporations began to be available for purchase, they were for purchase on the cheap, because they were basically uncapitalized, and they just needed to be given a better business structure. They had, all the modern equipment. They had, big factories. They had a lot of employees. So you had to reshuffle a lot of things, and then they basically were converted into big money-making companies. So Petro Poroshenko began with first with a successful business. He began to expand and buy more businesses, and he began to get his fingers into different areas of government, regulations, and began to exert influence on the political process. So it mentions here about how he took advantage of loosely regulated 1990s privatization to take a majority stake in Russian Ukreprominvest industrial group, multiple automotive and manufacturing enterprises, and Roshan is a confectionery, so candy. So basically, he looked for the most profitable businesses, where all these businesses began to fail. So he began to pick up the most profitable ones that he could see would work for him to increase his wealth. And then he began to expand his expansion into the media. So you talk about him acquiring Channel 5, which was a big media outlet in Ukraine. So that allowed him to get messages out to the whole country and to continue to expand his empire in shipbuilding, grain export, and banks. And then he began to get into politics. So he's a member of parliament, secretary of the National Security Council, head of the National Bank Council, foreign minister, trade and economic development minister, and it says that it gave him access to regulatory advantages, protection of business interests, and influence over state decisions that shape markets. So even ChatGPT will eventually, divulge good information. If you put in a general question, it'll churn out, the official narrative. But if you insert in more specific questions and you begin to do better investigations, then eventually ChatGPT is like, okay, you caught me. I was putting out a false narrative. Here's the real information. So the problem with Ukraine and its corruption are basically the wealth structures that the Ukrainian oligarchs and people associated with them set up in order to take control of the country, of its business, and to so they began to control elections, who's in office. They began to form their groups, maybe a political party, and they began to expand that. And so we start to see that corruption. You can see the corruption involved getting media. So the media is beginning to control the narrative on behalf of the oligarch. And so first we started with the question of who was to blame for the corruption in Ukraine. And ChatGPT told us it was the Russians, the Soviet Union, the legacy of the Soviet Union, the people who were trained within the Soviet Union. And then you begin to drill down a little more, and you finally get to the question of who's really behind corruption in Ukraine. Well, it's mostly the oligarchs, and so there's a lot of them in Ukraine, and all of these oligarchs also are fighting each other to control the government. And if they can control a state-run organization, then they can use that as an attack dog on the other oligarchs. So you can see that all of this is, the corruption in Ukraine is a system set up to protect the money interest and the corporate interests of these oligarchs. And so they have this large, pyramid of support, politicians, judges, lawyers, business leaders, universities, schools. And so all of this structure put together is what has created the Ukraine of today, which is extremely corrupt and seems to be unreformable. And I wanted to go back here to an earlier point, and this is my final point of this video. So now I'm 34 minutes. My goodness, this long video. So anyway, President Zelensky's administration has made major anti-corruption moves. Okay, very important. Especially since the full-scale invasion. What does that have to do with the corruption, the full-scale invasion? Oh, they went into survival mode. Okay, irrelevant. Okay, firing officials. Okay, what officials were fired? Were they the people who were corrupt, or they the people who were prosecuting the corruption? Reforming defense procurement. Okay, This is talking about all those contracts, those juicy contracts, like the $1 billion that was sent to Ukraine to set up a defensive line. And if you go to that defensive line, what will you see? A small little trench, not very long, with a bunch of dragon teeth spread out, kind of haphazard. And so basically, they paid, the Western countries paid $1 billion for Ukraine to set up a defensive line, and what they got was, a bunch of people going out with shovels, digging a trench for a distance, putting down dragon teeth, and then they could take pictures, look at the $1 billion, well used, send us more. Okay, so the defense procurement and empowering anti-corruption agencies. Okay, I think we got a historical problem here. The anti-corruption agencies were set up by the United States to control the flow of information about the corruption, so that the information about corruption would not get out to the news media, and so that Western countries would continue to send in, huge truckloads of cash into Ukraine. We can think back of the Biden administration and how it used the anti-corruption agencies to shut down any discussion about the corruption, about the Biden family in Ukraine. And so Zelensky didn't empower any corruption agency. In fact, he tried to shut down the NABU and the SAPO anti-corruption agencies that were set up by the U.S. But remember, is Zelensky a leader or a puppet? He's a puppet. So when the puppeteer in Washington said, oh, by the way, you're not going to shut down NABU or SAPO because this is our tools to maintain information flow out of Ukraine, Zelensky had to say, oh, gee, okay, you win, I'm the puppet. So, but corruption still exists because it is a system, not a person. Okay, I went into the whole thing about Petro Poroshenko. He's a person, not a system. And he has other people working for him who are people, not systems. So, who's to blame? There's not a single person or group responsible. Instead, corruption in Ukraine is a product of historical structures. Okay, we're going to go back 30 years. Okay, so if you go down to the store and steal a candy bar, you can say, it was my grandfather's fault. It was not my fault, so I'm innocent. Okay, who's going to believe that? Nobody. So anyway, ChatGPT is full of Western narratives, full of propaganda. So you have to drill down. Then we drill down into the oligarchs and then into Petro Poroshenko, who is one example of many corrupt oligarchs in Ukraine. So basically, yes, corruption is a person. And remember, Zelensky is a person. And maybe the golden toilet, which would cost $6.5 million to create by taking gold and making it into the form of a toilet. So the golden toilet is a clear symbol that corruption is rife in Ukraine, because when does the golden toilet show up? It shows up in those 2-bit third world dictatorships where money flows and people are working like ants in the society, while somebody above is the feudal lord, and they have so much money they don't know what to do with it, so they make a golden toilet. So they say in the corruption that they say in Ukraine that the corruption was $100 million, and if a golden toilet is 6.5 million, then that's basically 6%. I don't think if somebody had $100 million that they would spend it on a golden toilet. So I think we're talking about much more than $100 billion. $100 million. I think we're talking about billions of dollars. So anyway, this video is starting to become real long. I'm starting to get to the 40 minute, so I'll let it go for now. If you like this video, please hit the like button. And so thanks for joining me today. Subscribe and share. Thanks again for joining me at the Rowell Report. Have a good day. Bye-bye.